Welcome everyone to this session on wider forms of abuse. Thank you for joining us today. We welcome any questions that may arise during the training. However, we understand that some questions will come up after the training, so please feel free to note our emails that I'm going to show you on the next slide, and you can contact us directly after the email, after the presentation. So, welcome. My name's Janet Scott. I'm the subject specialist at NCFE for playwork and supporting teaching and learning. And I will be taking you through this webinar this afternoon, and hopefully you will find it informative and useful. You can see my email address here on the PowerPoint slide, so please take a note of it. And as I said in the introduction, if you have questions after the session, please feel free to email me directly. So this webinar is a bite-sized CPD session for you where we will be exploring female genital mutilation, FGM. We'll be looking at honour-based violence, child sexual exploitation and breast ironing. We will be raising awareness of these wider forms of abuse through considering signs and indicators, recognising children and young people's vulnerabilities, and reflecting on our own policies and practice. Some of the topics covered today may be hard to hear, so please do take care of yourself, and I will let you know when we have some sensitive case studies coming up, should you wish just to turn the volume down for that. But before we start, I'd just like to explore how confident you feel with your knowledge and understanding of these wider forms of abuse that are not often talked about, not covered so frequently. So if we just reflect for a moment, and we think about a score of 10 being extremely confident and 1 being not confident at all, where do you feel amongst that scale about your confidence and your knowledge of the forms of abuse that I've highlighted that we're going to discuss today? And at the end of the session, we will revisit this poll and see if you feel more comfortable and knowledgeable around these sessions. So let's start with FGM, female genital mutilation. Does anybody know any other words that are used for this? You might have heard some of these words here that's shown on this slide. I'm not going to read them out, but do take a moment just to have a look at them. You may have heard them in conversations or seen these words before. And other terms you may have come across is the term cutter. A cutter is somebody who carries out FGM. And you may have heard the term cutting season. This often refers to the summer months, July, August, September time, when many girls are on a break from school. And this is often the period when girls have the time to undergo FGM. So young girls may be flown abroad during this time, and it's important to be aware of the risk that we're going to cover in the slides coming up, but also of this terminology, because it may be words that you hear in conversation. So let's explore what FGM is. The World Health Organization states that FGM is a traditional harmful practice that involves the partial or total removal of external female genitalia or other injury to female genital organs for non-medical reasons. This practice has no health benefits for girls and women, and it can lead to not only immediate health risks, but also long-term complications to a woman's physical, mental, sexual health and well-being. The practice is mostly carried out by traditional circumcisers who often play other central roles within the community, such as attending childbirth. And in many settings, healthcare providers perform FGM due to the belief that the procedure is safe. FGM is mostly carried out on young girls between infancy and around the age of 15, and it is a violation of the rights of children. The practice also violates a person's right to health, security, physical integrity, the right to be free from torture and cruelty or degrading treatment, and the right to life when the procedure results in death. It is important to point out that this is a very strong belief, And as much as some people will be outraged and angry, this is something that is traditional in some communities, and therefore it will be their normal. So education is the key, ensuring that you know the details so that you can react calmly and with no judgment and support children that may be due to undergo FGM or have already undergone FGM. It is important to know that FGM is illegal, and as practitioners, you have a duty of protection. It's illegal in the UK and it is classified as child abuse. So under the FGM Act 2003 or even the Serious Crimes Act 2015, it is an offence to perform FGM, and that includes taking a child abroad for FGM. It's an offence to help a girl perform FGM on herself in or outside of the UK. It is an offence to help anyone perform FGM in the UK. And it's also an offence to fail to protect a girl for whom you're responsible for from FGM. Now, by law, anybody that performs FGM can face up to 14 years in prison. And anyone found guilty of failing to protect a girl from FGM can face up to 7 years in prison. So this is a really serious form of abuse. So you may notice some signs that girls may have been through FGM when they're returning to your setting or to school, especially after the long school summer holidays. And some of the signs that you might notice include having difficulty walking, standing or sitting. It might be that they spend longer in the bathroom or the toilet, or that they appear quiet and anxious or depressed. Another key sign is acting differently after an absence of school or college. So you can see here the recurring theme is the absence, the unexplained absence, or when there's been a long school holiday. Maybe that there's a reluctance to go to the doctors or have routine medical examinations. And young girls may ask for help, although they might not be explicit about the problem because they're scared or embarrassed. So it's important as practitioners that you have this knowledge. So if a child is asking you for help, that you can read between the lines, you can read between the words that they are saying to you, and you know or you can suspect if FGM has been involved. Now I'm going to read you a case study in a minute. So I just want to warn you, it is sensitive. And I'll let you know, so you may wish not to listen to this case study. It's a hard-hitting study, but it does highlight some of the important indicators that we need to be aware of. So I'm going to turn the slide now and read out the case study. I was born in Sierra Leone and I lived with my mother and sister. I was only 8 years old when I was cut. My mother told me it would be a grand ceremony, and my mother and auntie bought me a really pretty dress, and they invited lots of other women, and there was music and dancing. Then the women took me to an empty room, and she pinned me to the floor by pressing my shoulders hard. Another woman held my left leg, and a third held my right leg. They hurt me as they held my legs open. At that point, I started panicking. I asked them to let me go, but they didn't listen. My mother disappeared, and the only familiar face was that of my auntie, who kept telling me to lay down and be quiet. A very old lady came in and sat in front of my open legs. She got out a piece of cloth, and she took out a blade and started cutting me. There was no anesthetic. The pain was excruciating, and I started screaming. I tried with all my might to free my legs, but the two women holding me, they kept holding harder and harder, and I kept screaming louder and louder, but no one came. The woman kept cutting. I thought I was going to die. I think I fainted at that point. The woman tied my legs afterwards, and I was like that for 3 or 4 weeks, with my legs tied together. I could not sit down to go to the toilet. I felt betrayed by my mother. I did not want to talk to her. She told me that when I grew up, I would be able to have children safely and that my husband would love me. But since that day, I've had a lot of pain when I passed water. And when I started having a period, I would scream with agony. When I was older, I was married. I could not have children. It might have been a result of the cutting. My husband left me because he had the right to take another wife and because he said I brought him bad luck. It's a pretty hard-hitting story from a young 8-year-old girl. Okay, we're going to move on. So after listening to that little girl's story and thinking about how she thought she was going to a party and how betrayed she felt by her mother, what do you think you could do? A child who is faced or is worried about FGM might not realize what's happening to them is wrong, and they might even blame themselves. So like in all cases of abuse, if a child talks to you, it's really important that you listen carefully to what they're saying. As I said before, they might not be able to explain exactly what's been going on, or they might be too embarrassed. So listen carefully to what they're saying and let them know they've done the right thing by telling you. It's not their fault. Reassure them that it's not their fault and that you will take them seriously. It's important that we explain what you would do next, and as with all cases of abuse or suspected abuse, that you report what the child has told you as soon as possible. Again, important to refer to Children's Services team, follow your own safeguarding policies and procedures. But if the child is in imminent danger, 999 must be called. So there is an overview of FGM to raise awareness of what that is. And next we move on to breast ironing. So firstly, what is breast ironing? You may or may not have heard it. Some people call it breast flattening. But breast ironing is the process whereby a young girl's breasts are ironed or massaged or pounded through the use of hard objects like stones or hammers, or objects sometimes that are even heated over coals so that they're hot. And the idea is to make the breasts disappear or delay the development of the breast by pounding them. Other families may opt to use an elastic belt or binders to press the breasts so to prevent them growing. Breast ironing typically starts with the first signs of puberty, which could be as young as 9 years old. And according to United Nations, is often done by the victim's own family under the misguided intention of protecting her from rape and sexual harassment. And it's sad to think that in many cases, the abuser thinks they are doing something good by delaying the effects of puberty so that the girl can continue with her education rather than getting married. So it's important to know that breast ironing can happen anywhere in the world, including communities here settled in the UK. And it is thought that about 1,000 girls in West African communities across the UK have been subjected to this practice, but the figure could be much, much higher because it's very, very underreported. And it is important to understand that the mutilation is a traditional custom. And in Cameroon, it's designed to make the teenage girls look less womanly and to deter unwanted attention from men, unwanted pregnancies and rape, as well as preventing dishonor that could be brought upon the family if the girl begins sexual relations outside of marriage. So whilst it's very traditional in Cameroon, it's also practiced in the Central and West African communities. But I must emphasize that it is happening here in the UK as well within communities. So it is a wider form of abuse that you do need to be aware of. So breast ironing is often a well-kept secret between the girl and often her mother. And this can make it very difficult for professionals to identify. So care must be taken to sensitively navigate this deep-seated cultural belief. And many girls will not disclose that they are a victim of breast ironing for fear that their mother will get into trouble. And more often than not, they believe it's been done for their own good. Now, it's interesting to hear that many Cameroonian men are totally unaware of this practice until very recently, because there is a growth in campaigns to tackle the issue. So let's pause for a moment now and just think about the consequences of breast ironing. We understand now what it is. It's that pounding of the breasts with heavy objects, many times heated objects, to try and prevent the breasts from developing. So as well as extreme pain and psychological damage, this practice puts a young woman at increased risk of developing cysts, infections, and even cancer. It can leave women with inverted nipples, which means they're unable to feed their own children. It can lead to tissue damage and sometimes fever, and even a complete disappearance of one or two of the breasts. So let's pause for a moment and just have a little think now. What do you think the signs and indicators could be if a young girl has been subjected to breast ironing? How might you notice those signs? And we've got a few examples here. So it could be that a girl is embarrassed about her body and doesn't want to get changed for PE or any kind of physical activity due to scars that are showing. And like FGM, may be very reluctant to undergo medical examinations. If a girl is born to a woman who's undergone breast ironing herself, it may be that tradition will carry on and that the mother would perform breast ironing on her daughter. And it may be that there's an older sibling or cousin within the family that has undergone breast ironing as well. And that may be a sign that here you may have a young girl that's at risk. There may be references to breast ironing that comes up in conversation, and young girls might talk to their friends about it. Sometimes young girls may request help from a teacher or another adult if she is aware or suspects that she is at risk. And if you understand that one or both parents consider breast ironing integral to their cultural identity, there's a good chance that their child, their daughter, may be subject to this practice. And often there's strong levels of influence by the elders. And we've also noticed that the girl or the family quite often has limited levels of integration within the UK communities. Now, it's important to know that whilst there's no specific law within the UK around breast flattening or breast ironing, MPs are calling for this to become a criminal offence. And it is a form of physical abuse. And if professionals are concerned that a child may be at risk or suffering significant harm, of course, they must refer to their local safeguarding procedures and the policies within your own setting. Moving on now, I'd just like to spend a moment talking about honour-based violence, raising awareness of what this wider form of abuse is. So honour-based violence is a term used to refer to a collection of practices used predominantly to control the behaviour of women and girls within families or other social groups in order to protect supposed cultural and religious beliefs, values and social norms in the name of honour. And for example, honour-based violence may be committed against people who are talking or interacting with men, perhaps becoming involved with a boyfriend or a girlfriend from a different culture or a different religion. Maybe that there's sex before marriage, or the desire to escape an arranged marriage or forced marriage. Or it may be that the young person has adopted westernized dress and taken part in activities which may not be considered traditional within a particular culture. There may be threats of violence, domestic violence, and assault. Generally, it is women and girls that are most commonly victims of honour-based violence. However, it can also affect men and boys, and that is important to remember. And the crimes committed in the name of honour might include sexual assault, rape, forced marriage, genital mutilation, kidnap, false imprisonment, disfigurement, stalking. It's all pretty disturbing. And in the most extreme cases, people are killed because their actions are thought to be dishonourable. Honour-based violence might include written or verbal threats, psychological abuse, abusive phone calls or emails and messages, sexual harassment, threats to kill, pressure to move abroad, house arrest, no access to a telephone or internet or passport or car keys, and isolation from friends and family. In other words, victims may be cast out by their family and community with very little support. And this is high risk for those that have no access to money or financial independence or support. So honour-based violence, again, is an underreported form of abuse because those at risk can feel tied by family loyalties and community loyalties and are too distressed to speak out. So like the other forms of abuse, let's just pause for a moment and think about what the signs and symptoms might be if a young person that you know or you're working with is being subject to honour-based violence or even potential honour-based violence. What does a professional might you notice? You may notice that they're acting withdrawn or upset. There may be some unexplained injuries, possibly self-harming, attempted suicide. There may be unexplained absences or suddenly poor performance in their schoolwork. And quite likely their movements at home are very strictly controlled and their social relationships have narrowed. You might be aware of family rows and domestic violence. And there may be family history of relatives going missing or the young person running away from home. But also thinking about schoolwork, it isn't always poor performance. Sometimes victims may excel at schoolwork or their employment as symbols of freedom, as a way of escaping this. But it is a very difficult form of abuse to identify. And so if you have any suspicions, your normal safeguarding policies and procedures in your setting should be followed. It's a really good idea to have one-to-one discussions about well-being and offer support to students, as well as signposting them for further support, because you never know what's going on behind closed doors. So we've highlighted some forms of abuse, and one of the forms of abuse that we talked about in a previous training session was linked to faith and belief, where we look into this a little bit further. So if you're interested in that, you can find that recording on our events page if you want to know more about abuse that's linked to faith and beliefs. So I'm now going to play my second case study, and we can hear from Ruby, who was a victim of honour-based violence. So if you find this topic very sensitive, please take a moment just to turn the volume down or mute the recording, and we'll listen to Ruby's story. Okay, that was really quite distressing, wasn't it, to listen to Ruby's story? And terribly sad to hear about the red flags that she felt where opportunities were missed for help. So what could you do? What could you do to help someone like Ruby? Well, I think the most important thing is that if somebody is in immediate danger, then 999 must be called. There are other reporting services. You could call 101, you could make a visit to your local police station or call Crime Stoppers. And I've also put a link here to a national charity that you could make contact with. But what can we do in our settings? The most important thing is to raise awareness. Raise awareness of what this is, what it means, the signs and the symptoms that I've talked about beforehand, and the different ways that honor-based violence might play out. Training your staff is really important as well, and empowering children and young people, empowering them to speak out, empowering them to have the knowledge. You might want to have a look at your policies at the end of this webinar and see whether honor-based violence is included, and if not, why not reflect on that and do a little bit of research and see if we can't include that in your policies. But most importantly, be aware of the signs. Keep your eyes open and speak out and seek help so that those red flags that Ruby talked about won't happen to another child or young lady. We have been asked by a few centres to include some content here about sexual consent within our sessions, and we felt that this is something that we could be added here. And sexual violence is any sexual activity that takes place without someone's consent. And I'd like to play you this super video that explains what consent is, what it looks like, and what it doesn't look like. What a brilliant way to illustrate what consent means. It's as simple as tea. So if somebody consents to sex, it means that they agree by choice, and also that they have the freedom and the capacity to make that choice. So let's have a think about some examples of when a person might not have freedom or capacity to give consent. It may be that they're too drunk or under the influence of drugs, which may mean they do not have the mental capacity to consent to any sexual activity. And they may not understand what they're agreeing to, even if they do say yes. Could be, as we saw in that animation, could be asleep or unconscious. If someone is being manipulated or threatened into sexual activity, they do not have the freedom to consent, and their decision is influenced by fear. And if someone is unable to withdraw consent, for example, they aren't able to communicate clearly, then they don't have the freedom to express consent. And if they can't say no, then they can't say yes either. And legally, if someone is under the age of 16 years, they are not deemed as having capacity to consent. So I wanted to share that with you. We've had a lot of requests for a little bit of content on sexual consent, and I thought that would be a fabulous way just to illustrate it to you. Got a couple of myths here I'd like you to pause for a moment and have a think about. What do you think the answers are to these myths? If you're in a relationship with someone, it's always okay to have sex with them. The fact is, everyone has the right to say no to any type of sexual activity at any time, including with their partner. And consent must be given and received freely every time. Let's have a look at the other myth. When it comes to sex, women and girls give out mixed signals. They sometimes play hard to get and say no when they really mean yes. What do we think about that myth? The fact is, everyone has the legal right to say no to sex and to change their mind at any point, as we saw in the animation. If the other person doesn't stop, then they're committing sexual assault or rape. When it comes to sex, we must check in with our partners, respect their wishes, and believe what they tell us when they do and don't give consent. Now we're just going to have a think about child sexual exploitation, CSE. We're going to explore what that means and what the signs and symptoms might be. So child sexual exploitation is a type of sexual abuse. Children in such situations and relationships receive something such as gifts, money, affection, as a result of performing sexual activities or others performing sexual activities on them. And these children and young people are often tricked into believing they're in a loving relationship, when in reality, they're being groomed. They may trust their abuser and not understand that they're being abused. And so children and young people can be trafficked into or within the UK to be sexually exploited. And they're commonly moved around the country and abused by being forced to take in part of sexual activities, often with more than one person. So what do we think the signs are? This can be a really difficult one to spot. Sexual exploitation can be really difficult. And sometimes it's mistaken for just general teenage behavior. They could display that they are they're frightened of some people or certain places and situations and being secretive. Many teenagers are secretive, have changes in their mood or their character. But some key pointers here is having money or things that they can't explain or that they won't explain how they got them. There may be physical signs of abuse like bruising and bleeding in their genital areas. And they could have sexually transmitted infections or even pregnancy. So as before, within other signs of abuse, if a child talks to you about sexual exploitation, it's really important that you listen carefully to what they're saying and let them know that they've done the right thing by telling you. And reassure them it's not their fault and that you will take them seriously. It's important that you don't confront the alleged abuser and explain to the child and the young person what will you do next, and that you will report this and that you will follow your settings, procedures, safeguarding procedures. So you can see that a lot of these signs of abuse we've talked about today are very subtle. So it's important that you have knowledge and understanding, that your team are trained, and that awareness is shared so that you can spot these very subtle signs and symptoms that the children may be subjected to abuse. So it's time now just to reflect on what we've heard today. And we've listened to Ruby's story. We've listened to the case study of a young girl in Sierra Leone. And I want you to think about your key takeaways. What are you going to do next, and how will this have an impact in your practice? It might be that you're going to go back and look at your policies and see whether you've got honour-based violence included in your policies. Or it may be that you feel that you need to raise awareness amongst your staff or promote some key charities and organisations that might support young people that are going through some of these wider forms of abuse that we've covered today. How will your reflections impact on your learners? Okay. There is plenty of support and guidance available, and we've put a few of the key links here so that you can do some further research and perhaps download some of the support packages so that you can share with your staff or use them within staff training. The NSPCC is a superb source of all sorts of resources, not just on child sexual exploitation, as I've put there. I'd like to take this point to remind you that Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance was updated. Make sure you've got the 2022 version in your policies and procedures. We've put a link there for the FGM, National FGM support, and some refuge charity for women and children, and rape crisis in England and Wales. But there are lots of other support and guidance organisations out there with some very, very valuable help. So just to recap on our intentions, this is a bite-sized CPD session where we have raised awareness and explored female genital mutilation, breast ironing, honour-based violence and child sexual exploitation, and we've touched on the subject of consent and what is sexual consent and what is not consent. The purpose of the webinar was to raise awareness of these wider forms of abuse, and we've considered the signs and indicators. We recognise children's vulnerabilities, and we've thought about the policies and practice that you may have in your settings to help keeping children and young people safe, and how you may reflect on those policies and procedures after this webinar. Just like to highlight some future bite-sized webinars coming up. We have one on prevent duty and radicalisation. There is a bite-sized webinar on domestic abuse and also county lines. And remember, I mentioned that abuse linked to faith and beliefs, you can find that on our website. That was a past webinar that's been recorded. So if you want to look at that, you can find that on our website. Now, we're always keen at NCFE to hear from you. If you have any other suggestions for topics for the future for our bite-sized safeguarding webinars, do let us know. You can email me directly on the email address I put on the first slide. So we'd love to hear from you if you have any other topics that you would like us to present webinars on. Let's revisit the poll now. So at the beginning, I asked you to sit and reflect about how confident you were with your knowledge and understanding of these different forms of abuse, these lesser known forms of abuse, and 10 being extremely confident and 1 being not very confident at all. So maybe pause for a moment and reflect again and see how your knowledge and your understanding may have improved after listening to this webinar. Now, I don't think we have any questions. Nothing has come through today, so I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you for attending today's session. And I hope to see everybody back at the next bite-sized session. And lastly, on behalf of everyone here at NCFE, I wish you a continued safe and successful year. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.